this week's a little bit different. The face has changed again, and very soon my face won't appear either. There'll be another person, just to keep it all mixy-uppy. But this one is, I've brought a guest along. This is Sarah Baker, and Sarah is going to introduce herself in a minute. And I'm going to interview Sarah. So less a chatter, less a natter, and more an interrogation. She doesn't know that yet. She thought it was called the friendly natter, but really I'm going to throw questions at her. So, Sarah, tell us a bit about yourself.
So I'm Sarah Baker. I've worked in education for over 20 years. My passion is working with parents, meeting the needs of their children, really with a SEND focus. I'm actually a SENCO, as well as worked in secondaries, primaries and across trusts. So hoping I can answer your questions.
Oh, I think so, because what we're going to focus on today is that early spotting of needs. So it's an interesting one for teachers, because hopefully you can give them some hints and tips about how they can really start to spot the telltale signs that somebody probably needs an extra intervention or two. But then I want to dimensionalize it, because we're parent-friendly schools, and the parent has a partnership within that, which isn't always well managed in that first instance, which can, I don't know if you agree, nod or shake your head, can create frustrations and anxieties in the parent if it's not dealt with well, which can escalate to quite serious challenges in relationship. So let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to begin, as Julie Andrews once told us. So how do teachers spot those early needs? So we're 2 weeks in? They've just got their primary school, just got their new class. At secondary school, they've got 6 classes, probably 7 classes if they're an English teacher, 43 classes if they're an RE teacher. How do they spot those individual needs?
You'd hope they'd have really honed observational skills. So they're looking at mood, sort of a focus of a child. They're looking at those relationships that are being built, not just with themselves, but actually with peers. You'd hope you'd be able to pick up on some behaviour patterns, maybe understanding if any child is a little withdrawn, maybe frustrated, acting out in any way that maybe seems a little bit different to the rest of the peer group, and maybe thinking about any social dynamics that maybe are coming to light. And I'd say this is really early days, because the future stuff would be the assessment data, the classwork, the homework, and any sort of gaps, getting a bit behind, some of the specific subject knowledge not sticking. So I think if they can, it's really about being a detective at this point in the term.
So let's just dive into a couple of those. So behaviour, which is, I watched a video of somebody who said they hated the idea of a focus on kids' behaviour, like it was a condemnation of them as a human rather than the situation they find themselves in and how they're choosing to act. So let's just presume that any acting out at the beginning of the term is likely to be an underlying cause. So
yeah,
is that fair?
I'd say so. I'd say that they're probably struggling to fit in, especially if it's a transition from primary to secondary. Generally, I'd say some of those young people may do things that may seem a bit inappropriate compared to the rest of the class. Behaviour is a really funny term as well, because, yeah, for me, it's normally a form of communication and they're trying to tell you something. So I think, yeah, getting that clear is really important. But I think also, if you're really concerned as a class teacher, go and have a discussion with the SENCO pastoral team around that child and see if there's any transition notes that might help, because there's normally a lot in a file, and time is a pressure for everyone, isn't it? And it's whether that's been diluted in a way that can provide more information if it's a deeper read.
And that's one of the parts of the detective story. I mean, you were a primary specialist, correct? And I'm is that correct?
Secondary, and I've worked across primary.
And you've worked across primary. So I'm at primary. I think it's slightly different because you take on a class and you generally have a good. It feels like they have a better briefing than we do in secondary school, and it feels like they have more contact with the parent than we do within a secondary setting. And as an English teacher, obviously, I was blessed with only having and a head of English as well, so I only had about 5 classes max. So I had time to be investigative. But if it is recognizing that you've probably not had information passed on to you, is that right? In that sense.
Yeah, no, I think also it's about being a bit proactive yourself.
Mm.
And making sure that if you have those concerns that you seek other adults out, you're not in this alone, and actually gathering information. And as I said, the tutor in secondary is normally got more information. Then maybe it's the overall pastoral lead for that year group or that house or however they've grouped them. And then thinking a little bit more about that Senko. I'd also say, getting the parent involved, but you need to think really carefully about the process within your school, because as a class teacher, you might not have that direct link.
Yeah, no, fair. Let's get to that in a little while because I just still want to dig into this. And that you skipped to number 3, Sarah Baker. So you allowed. I'm just bossy. So I let's dig into what to spot first. So you rightly, I think, and I congratulate you for you say that behaviour is a communication tool, and we've just got to interpret what they're trying to say to us. The second part of what you said was about interactions with others. And I was wondering if you could give me some specific examples of things that you, I mean, this might be a bit hard, but things that you would spot where you think, hmm, there might be something else going on. So, shall I give you a for instance from my experience? Or
Go ahead.
do you already know how to answer the question and I don't need to patronise you?
Well, I'd have thought about you looking at when that child arrives in your classroom,
Mhm.
especially from a secondary point of view. If they're tagging along to a group, how they actually interact in a group scenario. But then I'd also think about whether or not they're actually properly integrated. And I mean that from a point of view as, are they actually taking an active part in what's happening, or are they on the sideline? And if they're on the sideline, is it that they're watching to observe to see how they behave in those situations? Because they might have additional needs, and that might be one of their coping strategies, to sit on the sideline, watch, and then take a slower approach. But you generally find that you'll have one or two. And a friend of mine spoke to me last week. She ended up with a year 7 class, and a child arrived midway through her lesson, brought in by a pastoral lead, and sat in class and was really upset. And she said she found that really difficult because no other child really wanted to engage. But actually, that child obviously had a lot going on, but nobody passed or communicated that information to her. So she felt that she had to keep checking in and actually trying to unpick what was going on. And there was a need for attention. But actually, when unpicking all of that, one of his lessons that he wasn't very secure in was maths. And it was a maths lesson.
So that would have been good information to pass on, which doesn't always get passed on. But equally, there's no learning when you're in that level of threat or upset, is there? As we know, you need the foundations in place in order to build on the top of those. So that's interesting. The example I was going to give you is part behaviour and part interaction, which is he'd come with a reputation for being badly behaved, which meant that every teacher sat him at the front. However, he always needed to turn around because, and it took me a while to puzzle out that actually what he needed was to sit with his back to the wall because he couldn't handle the sense of others behind him. And his bad behaviour was actually a consequence of that need to have the wall at his back so he could see the whole space. And then all the difficulties disappeared. It's weird, isn't it? How you have
It's
to.
unlocking that tiny bit of additional information. Normally it's only tiny, but it makes such a difference.
Well, mostly because he felt understood, as opposed to being told he was naughty all the time. So, in some respects, it also bought me loyalty points for him because I'd taken the time, and that's also the win you get, isn't it? When you take the time to do the detective work. Number 3, we're there. So you were beginning by saying, knowing when to bring the parent in is tricky. True story. But are they not part of the detective story, potentially?
They are, and they've got a critical insight. And I would say that they share a context around life changes, health issues, routines, emotional sensors, all those things that are really, really important. And actually, that partnership between home and school, if you're trying to support a young person, needs to be joined up. And it also, whatever they're implementing at school can then be reinforced at home as well. And home want to support, they want to get involved. And it's being responsive and open to a parent sharing some information that could actually be really quite difficult for them to share.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
being an active listener and actually just taking that time and showing you care, and that you feel valued for, you know, being trusted by that parent to give that information is really, really important.
we talked a lot about empathy last week, Anna and I. And this is definitely a moment for empathy, right? Because being a parent is full of challenges and expectations and that worry of being judged. And the biggest, in some respects, one of the biggest challenges is feeling judged by the school who's looking after your child, and the sense of failure that comes from that. So just to give voice to how challenging it is for us to talk about this, but how challenging it is if you don't talk to them about it as well. Have you ever dealt with a parent where they've not been kept informed, and the consequences of that at all?
Yeah, and there's a lot of why haven't I been told? Why are you only listening now? Why am I only now involved in what's going on? And actually it's my child, and actually I'm the expert. I gave birth to them. I know the story of what happened at nursery, primary, you know, and actually why they are acting in this particular way, or they might struggle with this, or and I think that's a real challenge when you come in and you've done that invite to parents too late, because you've got a lot of bridges to build. And sometimes that's often when the senior leaders are brought in and they haven't got that relationship. So it's making sure that you've got the right people around the table to support the conversation, but the parent within what's happening. And if they do need some additional support, making sure that actually you've got those provisions in school that can then support them, as well as supporting the young person, the child at the centre.
I always think that if you are bringing them in because you're having to deal with an incident or a problem, you've probably left it too late.
Absolutely. So getting them involved early is really, really important. And having some proactive conversations. And I'd always say, you know, have an open evening quite early on for year 7, but do it around some celebratory pieces of work in the first sort of few weeks. Bring them in so that actually the child could just take them around and say, these are my classrooms. It doesn't have to be really threatening. So these are my classrooms, and the teachers have their books out. And it's really quite informal. It's not, this is how they're doing necessarily in that academic subject. It's actually, let's come on, school's open, let's go and have a cup of tea, and let's see my classroom, see what I do.
I used to work in a school called the Castle School in Taunton, and they used to have an event at the start of the year where they did just that. So it wasn't a case of it's a parents' evening, come and sit with the teacher and talk about your child. It was come drop in, but it was a wonderful opportunity to, if a parent wanted to talk to a specific teacher but felt too shy to contact the school, and equally if the teacher just wanted to informally ask a query rather than elevate it to a phone call where the parent feels like the child's been bad at school and now they're being dragged in. Do you see what I mean? So it like to have those very quiet conversations, like you say.
And it's about being really open and making sure that you've got a non-judgmental tone. Quite a lot of new teachers don't necessarily have their own children, so it's just thinking about that when they're very early on in their career. It's, as a more experienced teacher, how can you give them some, I suppose, choice support for those parent conversations they're going to have? And if you really want to focus on something when you meet a parent for the first time, make sure that you've got something really positive to share.
Yeah, do that wonderful sandwich that you would do when you're managing a colleague, where you give positive, and leave the difficult conversation in the middle. So you set the tone positively, leave the conversation positively, but still get the information covered. Really good, really good point. I was talking with one of our client schools yesterday, and I was saying how even now, even though I was on a senior team and I was a teacher for a long time, if I was to be asked to go into a head teacher's office, it would still be imbued with all of that childhood terror of going into the head teacher's office, because you never grow out of it, do you? Even
No.
when I worked in a school with my head, he was still the head teacher or she was still the head teacher, and going into the office was a bit like, oh, what have I done?
I think it's still like that. It doesn't matter what position you're in, you still wonder.
You do, and that's what it's like for parents, though, isn't it? They walk into that office and they're 11 again or 12 again, and they're at such a disadvantage.
Especially if they haven't had a very positive experience themselves, they've got to overcome their own sort of barrier, but also then it's actually what else am I facing, especially if they are having some challenges at home and you know they're struggling. It is really difficult, and it's that empathy, isn't it, and working really collaboratively, I think, and it's a partnership.
That, I mean, but I don't. I mean, I'd like to say occasionally, with my tutor groups, I formed partnerships with my parents, relatively strong ones. But it was more by luck than judgment on my part, I think. Do you see what I mean? It was just because I happened to have a friendly conversation with them once and it stuck, rather than a conscious strategy. So I'm just wondering, how do you overcome what barriers they bring to it, which is their fear of school, their fear of judgment, etc., etc., and then all our insecurities that we're going to be judged a bad teacher, or that we're putting something on the parent when we should be handling it ourselves. And how do we overcome that and find that perfect moment?
I think, I mean, it's it's buying into that child and treating them as though they're the only one within that conversation. And I was always told to find something about that child that you knew that other people wouldn't know. So those at the door conversations, oh, how was horse riding at the weekend, or did you play on the football team, how was it at your dad's, I know you're worried about getting over there, did you make it in time, you know getting that sort of individual little bit of information about children so you can have those conversations, because actually generally the child comes with the parent to some of those conversations, so being able to see that you're invested, I think is really important.
And you know their child individually, because in their perception, the worst thing to feel is that their child is one of 100 and you don't know who they are.
Or you've
So,
got them confused with somebody else. And
yes.
the number of times, I think, from a Senko point of view, I've had to mop up where you've sort of been scooped in to talk to a parent, and they're like, yeah, but that's what they used to do at primary school with so and so. And you go, oh, okay. And you're then trying to mop up what sort of you've been brought into. And I just think, yeah, a little bit of personal understanding knowledge goes a long way, and that can come as part of that detective hat in the first few weeks.
I actually found that knowing their first name and asking permission to use or asking the first time I met them if it was okay to use their first name, which isn't normal. Normally you would keep it quite formal, but with a tutor group especially, if I was then to use their name, it felt like I also knew them. And that would you do that, or you're a more formal human than me, though, aren't you?
I always use their first name, but I used to have an activity, and whether this is just coming from a geography background, we used to have a plate that was divided up into 6 parts, and we asked things like, "What's your favourite colour?" So colouring crayons come out, and the link in with geography, so you can. And
Education again, very geography.
yeah, definitely. What's your favourite like holiday location? what's your hobby? And that was one of our like little starters. And I found that really interesting. I used to stick that in the front of the book, and that used to just give me a little bit of a
child. Sorry, I meant first name of the parent.
Oh, well, parents' first name, that's interesting.
That's what I meant, because I would imagine you would still want to do Mr. and Mrs. or Ms. and Mr. or Ms. and Ms.
Ask, but I'd also probably guide myself into sort of asking them or saying to them, oh, I know that you've got sort of pets at home, so I'd probably say, you know, are you okay with me using your first name? Oh, when I was talking to, they told me about you've just got a puppy, or you've been. And so I would then hook back into my plate, because actually that instantly sort of got those discussions. So you'd often find my notes with a picture of the plate photographed, just so that I'd got it in the file.
Because it's the small talk that brings warmth to the conversation, isn't it? And the knowledge of them as humans. That's perfect. So that sort of answers the last one. And which is, how do we strengthen the partnership? But I wonder if you've got any other insights, because what I'm conscious of is I've seen it from both angles now, which is that when parents feel ignored and frustrated, and then that's when the complaints come in, and then that's when it gets escalated incredibly quickly, and then that's when it goes to external, when their internal parental reptilian brain is kicked off and they have to fight for their child. It's very, very difficult to pull them back from that point and to turn it around into a positive. So I'm just wondering, how do we build the partnership first to avoid that second?
I think it's always about the personal information that you've got. But I also think if you go back to what you said earlier about your positive sort of negative sandwich approach, if you're, say, working in that sort of more Senko space or tutor space, finding out about that child across the subjects gives you an idea of actually where their strengths are. Is it those academic foundation subjects? Is it those more sort of active subjects? And you know, where does that sit? And actually having some real positives to share, and then having a bit of a discussion around something that maybe isn't working, and how the parent can help you. You know, what do you do at home? Is there anything that you think works really, really well? And actually, can I share that? Are you happy for me to share that? Or actually, if you're struggling as well, how do we do this together? And how do we both reinforce that?
See, I think that's a wonderful way to start an early conversation. When you ring up and you go, how did you deal with this? And that thing.
But you know, when it's gone a little bit further,
yeah,
it's that, you know, when we sat down last time and we sort of worked on this, I'd really like to use that approach. So it's almost taking them back to an experience that worked well for both of you and trying to change that dynamic. And if you know it's going to be one of those conversations, think really carefully about where you're going to have it and what sort of time it is, how you set that room up, who else you maybe include, because have they got a really, really good relationship with somebody else if you're about to deliver something and you know they're coming in and it's not quite the way they want it to be.
Yeah.
How do you change what they think they're coming in for? And that's not to get them off guard. It's more to change that dynamic to make sure that actually everybody feels more comfortable.
And that's one of the practical tips, I think, because we're coming to the end now. So I was speaking with a client yesterday, and we were doing a coaching session. And she started to coach me, which is always the best way around. And I start to learn things in return. And she was saying how they'd set up a room with sofas, and they called it the living room. And that's where they had their meetings with parents. So rather than have a desk in between the teacher and the parent, there was two sofas that were at angles with each other. So you were talking at a diagonal. And I thought that was genius for relieving some of that tension of that power dynamic. Have you got something that you would leave the audience with in terms of a top tip?
A room very similar to that, but also making sure that actually if they're bringing other siblings along, that there's the play box, that you've got the biscuits available, that you've thought really carefully about actually everybody being on the same level as well, because I think that's really, really important. And I would also say, just thinking about, if you're collecting information, don't just sit and have like that meeting, but actually, is there stuff that you can put around the walls so people have to physically get up and use a pen or interact with some questions with some symbols and actually be part of what's going on? Because sometimes they come into a meeting, they're talked to, there's an outcome, but they haven't really moved. And sometimes moving can change that state in that room that can make a real difference.
Or been heard in that state. So giving them chance to speak. And I used to always give them chance to speak first before I delivered whatever I had to say. So that just to create a balance of dynamic of speaking to each other, bring it into a discussion. Anyway, do you know we've been going for 26 minutes? 26 minutes.
Time flies when you're having a really good discussion.
We just had the most wonderful, friendly Natter. It's been wonderful. And I have a feeling, an itchy feeling, we're going to see more of Sarah in the future. So speak to you soon.
Take care.